Hey everyone, now today we're going to be looking at how we can paint up the Thousand Sons Terminators. These have got a large amount of gilding and a lot of details on them, so we're going to be trying to streamline it where possible to make it quick and efficient in order to paint these up. These guys did come from the Combat Patrol for Thousand Sons, and we're going to be just focusing on the Terminators today and coming back and looking at some of the other models later. So do subscribe to make sure that you don't miss all of that good stuff. Otherwise, let's not waste any more time. We're going to be jumping in and going over how we painted up these really nice Terminators. Before we can tackle the painting, we will need to do some building. And here what we're going to be doing is, as per the instructions, clipping out all of the pieces, going round, removing all of the mold lines, and then gluing them together. However, there are a couple of areas we're not going to glue down. Namely, we're not going to be gluing down the shroud that goes around the helmet, as well as the helmet itself, which means that we have the ability to keep the helmets separate for painting purposes. We also want to make a minor conversion and swap out the weapons on these guys in order to make them slightly different from everyone else's. For this, what we're going to do is take some spears from an old Warhammer Fantasy kit, clip off the blades, and swap these onto the models in place of their original weapons. We can just mount them into place with a little bit of plastic glue and they should hold relatively firm. I am pretty sure that these blades came from the old Dark Elf Spearman kit, but I can't be 100% sure because I bought them years ago. So if you know the exact kit these blades come from, let me know, but they've been in the bits box for a while and now we're using them. Generally, if you wanted to swap out the blades for something of your own, just pick whatever blade you like the look of. I chose these because of the swooping nature of the blade. I think goes quite well with Tzeentch. And with that done, it is mainly down to the painting now. And as with most of the combat patrols that I try and do in a relatively quick manner, because I want to build up a large amount of them to a level that I'm happy with for tabletop purposes, we're going to be painting these guys up with a relatively quick manner, but trying to build out a fair amount of contrast. So from an arm's reach and from the table, they look good, even though the blending might not be as crisp and as perfect as we want. But to do this, we're going to want to be boosting the color contrast as well as the brightness contrast. And we're going to start off by using a zenithal highlight, but unlike the traditional black and white, we're going to be swapping those out for a red spray and a blue spray. We want to prime these essentially the way we do with zenithal priming, but first we're going to lay down a coat of the red, followed by then a coat of the blue. This is going to give us nice red recesses and shadows, while giving us a clean, clear blue for the rest of the base coat. From here, we're going to start to build out some of the underlying colours and textures, and we're doing this through dry brushing on a lighter blue over every single surface on the model. What this will do is nicely pick out all of those details sculpted on, as well as giving us a little bit of brightness. This allows us to come in and follow it up with another round of dry brushing. Here we're going to be using a light pale flesh. This time, when we're applying the dry brush, we want to focus mainly on all of the upward facing areas and edges, which should result in a nice transition from the red recesses through the blue and up to essentially a white on the brightest surfaces. By doing these 2 rounds of dry brushing, we are able to achieve a couple of things. First off, we're going to be using the blue over everything, so that includes the shadows and the recesses. This will add a bit of blue in those areas that are predominantly red because of the way that we've undercoated everything. Then we're going to be using the light flesh, and where this only targets the upward facing areas, so in everything from the top down essentially, that's going to give us a really nice light map across the model, so that we can see where light would be hitting all of the areas across the model, and we have a nice transition. But what we now need to do is come in and do a couple more steps, building on the work that we've done so far. And to do that, what I did was build a contrast wash, and we used, I think it was Celestian Blue, in 1 part with 3 parts contrast medium to make a really thinned and diluted contrast wash. This can then be used on all of the work that we've done so far to help smooth out any transitions, remove some of the texture from dry brushing, and set the stage perfectly for what comes after that. This diluted contrast can then be washed over all of the armor pieces, though we do want to make sure that we don't have too much excessive pooling in the recesses, but we do need some, just to ensure that the reds are turned to a nice purple hue. This will also have the benefit of smoothing out any of the texture from the dry brushing that we did earlier. As you can see here, this leaves us with armour that is purple in the recesses, building up to a brighter blue, which is where the flesh tone that we applied in the final dry brushing has been tinted by the contrast. This gives us a lovely highlight map that we can follow. All we want to do is grab a little bit of bright turquoise and mix this into our contrast, and then we can apply this all over the lighter sections of the armor. If we do this over a couple of layers, we can get a nice smooth transition from the darker blue base to this new turquoisey blue midtone. Naturally here, you can spend as much time as you want dealing with the transition from our dark blue to this new light blue. Because we're doing this for a video and we're on a little bit of a time crunch, we're just doing the steps from essentially the base coat to a midtone to a highlight. And the midtone we mixed up in its own little bottle, just mixing in some of the turquoise with our contrast, so that if we paint any more of these in future, like our leader, which we will be painting on the channel in future, we can use this to help us out and speed up the process. However, if you've got the time, the inclination, and you're not filming a video for YouTube, you could just use the highlight color and the base coat mid-range colors that we're using and slowly transition between them, adding more and more turquoise to get a gradual and nice transition up to our bright highlight color. Otherwise, we're going to be using the mid-tone, which we have, and then we're going in with a highlight using the brighter turquoise. When doing our final highlights, we're essentially going to use this color and repeat the last steps, but in a much narrower fashion. Mainly focusing on the largest upward facing panels, as well as any of the edges, essentially doing a typical edge highlight. Similar to the last step, we are just mainly following the path laid out by the previous painting steps, and then painting within the lines. Once we've gone round and done that bit of highlighting, it may not look like much, and that will mainly be because the rest of the model is still in its base coat blue, which is very close to the colour we've painted. So at this point, what we're going to do is black out all of those other details. These are things like the weapons, the metals, and all of the trim. We can work around using a black contrast and apply this to act as a new primer for those areas. The main reason we're going to choose to essentially re-prime all of the trim and metal elements now is to help us have some clarity in how our armor's looking. When all of the blue is around the blue that we've painted, it can make it really hard to isolate particular areas and see how they've come out. By going around and black lining out all of the other details and essentially re-priming those in another color, we're able to look solely at the contrast difference we've got in our blending and in our painting, and we can decide if that is okay at this stage. Also, the reason that we're using contrast, in case you're interested, is it's essentially a pre-thinned paint. And as long as we're not flooding the brush, which then would naturally flood the model, we can use it as a pre-thinned black and just go around really carefully, blocking out all of the areas that we're going to be using. And naturally, because it's black and we're going to be painting some metallics here as well, we get that nice effect of metallics being over a black, and they essentially work their best with their best shine, putting the best foot forward. We can start off the metallics with a dark gold, and here we can work around covering all of the gold areas that we've blacked out with contrast. So here we have obviously the trim, but we're also going to be making all of the other metal areas gold as well, except for the blades, for which we'll be doing something else a little bit special later on. Once the first round of gold is painted, we can then move on to a little bit of highlighting. And here it's nice and simple. We're going to use a slightly brighter gold and essentially edge highlight all of the metal work that we've done so far, as well as do some panel highlighting along the lines of any sections of armor that we've highlighted in blue. So essentially we want to be continuing the light effect on areas that we've already highlighted. When doing these highlights, it is very important to remember and align the highlights that we've done. So for example, on my arm, if we were looking at the highlights, we wouldn't want to paint the blue armor along here where the highlight is the brightest, and then do the highlight for the hand in another color here, because obviously the light would hit the whole surface at the same point. So we just want to make sure that we're aligning those highlight areas so it looks like a consistent beam of light is going down that area. Once we are happy with that though, and we've painted in the highlights on our metals, we can go in and do all of that joyous yellow that is all the way across the model in various smaller elements. And we're going to be taking a small advantage of a couple of tricks here and painting the robes at the same time. We want to start off with a mid skin tone, and here we're going to be base coating all of the fabrics, all of the yellow elements, as well as all of the bones. We can also go in and catch any of the eyes of Tzeentch across the various models. This may take a couple of coats to get a nice look over the blue base coat or black base coat, but we should get a nice layer or look after just a couple coats. It's then a case of highlighting, and all of these areas are going to get a nice simple highlight using a light skin tone, which is essentially going to be acting as our white. For the fabrics and the bones, we are going to want to build up the colors from the mid skin tone to the light skin tone along the shapes of the object in question, whereas the smaller elements can simply get a nice edge highlight before we go out and dig some washes for a select careful placement. We want to dig out a yellow wash to start off with, and we're going to be naturally applying this to all of the areas that we want yellow, while the bones are going to get a quick sepia wash just to bring out that bone tone for a little bit. And then the eyes of Tzeentch will get a dirty blue wash to change the hue of the skin and also pick out any of the sculpted details like the pupils on the eyes. Once the washes are dry, we only really have a couple of elements left, one of the main ones being the weapons. And for this I wanted to try and paint them in a different manner to how we've done everything else. I wanted to try and give them a metallic ethereal shifting colour palette, similar to that sort of patina you get from heated and cooled and heated metal with the oranges and the blues and the purples and things like that. And in order to do that, I didn't mix up any colours, I kind of just cheated a little bit and got some coloured metallics from Robeson Liquid Metals. But naturally, if you don't have these or anything similar, you can just mix in a little bit of ink into your normal metallics and you should get a similar sort of effect. To achieve this, we start off by base coating all of the weapons in a brown contrast. This is essentially going to act as our shadow, meaning that we don't need to use any of the brighter golds that we've used across the rest of the models, and we can just go in with our dark gold once the contrast is dry. We will be lightly dry brushing this dark gold over all of the chosen metal areas, giving a nice dark reflective tone. This can then be followed up by a reddish purple metal dry brush, and when we do this we're going to be targeting the blade from approximately halfway up the blade and then proceed up into the point. Then we will be doing the same thing, but this time instead of a reddish purple we'll be going in with a dark blue metallic and aiming to catch the very end, so the rough last third of the blade, before we take a very pale blue which is almost silver, and we're going to use a very light overbrush technique, essentially just on the edges to give the blade a sharp looking edge. At this point with the weapons done, there's not really that much left. We've got to do some touching up, so any areas that we've gone a little bit overzealous with any contrasts or some of the metals or anything like that, we can just grab our range of blues. For example, if there's metal on the blue armor, we can grab our ranges of blues and then just touch up and clean up any of those areas. While we're doing this, we're also going to be tackling the eyes of Tzeentch across the model, and we can just take the bright turquoise color and give them a quick highlight using that. But beyond that, the models are essentially done beyond being stuck on a base, which we will be doing shortly. And these guys are ready for tabletop display and a little bit of killing of the enemy. So overall, I'm relatively happy with how these came out. Have a look, let me know what you think. Let me know if you're relatively enthralled by the Thousand Sons, but the massive amounts of details and things like that across the model are a pain. Personally, I quite like the lore, but I've always been put off by the amount of details, and I think I shouldn't have been. I've quite enjoyed this process. So if you do want to see us paint the main character from this box set in a little bit more detail, essentially spending the same amount of time that we spent on this unit on just one model, do remember to subscribe because that's not out yet, but it will be soon. If you want more content for now though, what I would suggest is checking out this video, which is where we do something very similar to this, except we actually managed to paint an entire combat patrol instead of just one unit. Check that out. Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.